In this part 2 video of the respiratory system, I will talk about the lower respiratory system and get down into the lungs and look at what we call the business end of the system. Once we get past the trachea, there is quite a bit of branching that takes place over and over and over again, ultimately culminating in the alveolar sacs. So the trachea, we saw in a previous video, branches, and we get a right and left primary bronchus, which feeds the left and right lungs. Those bronchi then further branch into secondary bronchi. On the right side, there are 3 lobes to the right lung, so there are 3 secondary bronchi. On the left side, there are only 2 lobes because of the heart, and those are called secondary bronchi. Those then branch into tertiary bronchi. Those subsequently branch into bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, and ultimately leading to the alveolar sacs, or the alveolar ducts. So branching again and again and again as we are getting to finer and finer structures so that the oxygen that's in the air will get properly delivered ultimately to your blood. As we travel down through the respiratory system, the lining of these different airways will change. The epithelial tissue will change. So the primary bronchi are lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which we saw again in a previous video. And that continues through the secondary and the tertiary bronchi. When we get further down, now it will start to transform. And the bronchioles will generally have ciliated simple columnar, so not pseudostratified anymore, which will then change into non-ciliated simple cuboidal. Now we're changing the shape of the cells, and eventually we get into the alveolar sacs, and that will be simple squamous. All of these are designed to perform the function necessary at those different levels. Again, particularly when you get to the alveolar sacs, we have diffusion taking place so that we can get the oxygen into the blood. So if we kind of summarize all this, as we move from the trachea ultimately to the alveolar ducts, we have, first of all, a change in the epithelium. As we proceed, you will see a disappearance of the goblet cells. There isn't room for goblet cells anymore. So we'll have to get rid of debris, capture debris some other way. You'll start to change from plates of cartilage. Ultimately, you will then get increasing amounts of smooth muscle. So it's fairly soft tissue as we get further down deep into the secondary part of the respiratory system. So there's a gradual transformation structurally and functionally. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the lungs themselves and talk a little bit more about the anatomy and what goes on in the different locations. So here's a diagram of the lungs. I like looking at different perspectives. And here you can see your right lung. Now, again, that's going to be on the left side of your screen. You can see there are 3 lobes. And you can see how that trachea branched into a right primary bronchus, which then branched into secondary and tertiary bronchi. And again, it's going to get finer and finer and finer. On the left side, the right side on the screen, you only have 2 lobes, and you can see a big notch where the heart would be placed. A slightly different perspective, you can see how the lungs are protected by the rib cage. So the ribs are making sure that the soft tissue is not going to get damaged, and yet also performs a function of being able to allow the lungs to expand whenever you inhale air. Another slightly different perspective. These are highly vascularized, and you can see here, you see a little bit of the vascularization of the thorax, the thoracic cavity, and ultimately those alveolar sacs are going to be highly vascularized because we've got to get oxygen back into the blood. Now, let's just kind of point out some specifics of the lungs. Again, I like this diagram because on the right side, you've got the ribs in place. We've removed all the soft tissue that is superficial to this area. On the right side, we've pulled the ribs away and we can see the lungs directly. So at the very top, that's the apex, the apical part of the lungs, and you can see it sticks slightly above your collarbone. So you can see that you could actually have it extend where you could actually, if you were palpating, you could actually feel the upper part of the lung. So it sticks up way towards the top, superior portion of the chest. On the other hand, the basal part, you can see at the bottom, the base of each lung sits on this really thick sheet of muscle tissue. Of course, that is the diaphragm. That also is going to play a role, not only dividing the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, but also this will play a role in allowing the lungs to expand when you go to inhale air. If we expand the region of where the lungs are up against the thoracic cavity, chest wall, you can see there are multiple layers here. And we need to discuss what structures are there and what important roles do they play. So if I take that and blow it up a little bit, let's point out some tissue. So obviously A is going to be the lung itself. B, you've got a lining that covers the surface of the lung, and visceral would refer to an organ, so visceral pleura. So the actual membrane is called a pleura, and visceral means that it's actually covering the surface of the lung itself. You have similar tissue that also lines the inside of the cavity, and parietal refers to that. So when organs sit in a cavity, whether it's thoracic or abdominal, you're going to have tissue that covers the surface of the organ itself, but also that same tissue is going to cover the inside of the cavity. And here, of course, that would be really important because these are going to slide over each other as your lungs expand on inhalation and collapse a little bit on exhalation. D is a potential cavity. Okay, so they're actually separate from one another, and essentially they sit right up against each other, but that's a potential space, the pleural cavity. So if air were to get in there, if we were to have air either coming from the outside of the body through some kind of wound, or from the inside of the body through some damage to the lung, that little cavity would start to fill up with air and would start to expand. And of course, E, we're seeing a sort of a cross section here, and that's a cross section of one of the ribs that would curve out anteriorly and protect the lungs. So now let's get again to where is the oxygenation of blood going to really happen? And of course, that's in the alveolar sac. So that's why I refer to it as the business end. This is where the actual functioning of the lungs is going to take place. And so we kept branching all the different airways, and they culminate in these sacs, the alveolar sacs. And so if you want to think of this almost like a bunch of grapes, the alveolar sacs would be like a whole bunch of grapes, and then the individual grapes themselves would be the alveoli. And you can see you really have quite a bit of surface area. We're trying to get good contact between the air and the walls of the alveoli, which you can see are highly vascularized. You can see that a little bit on that left alveolar sac. You can see the both venous and arterioles, capillaries that are in contact with those membranes, and that's where the exchange of oxygen going one way and CO2 going the other way is going to take place. So let's blow that up, because this is really important that you understand what's going on at this position. Here you can see how vascularized. There's a lot of surface area, and so the structure has to match up with the function that needs to be performed here. We've looked at histological slides before, like this one here, where we've taken a slice of one of those alveolar sacs, and you can see how it's dead space in the center. And then you have a really, really thin membrane, and that's, of course, the squamous, simple squamous epithelium. So we want that nice and thin, because in this diagram you can see that's where we're going to allow diffusion to take place and oxygen to move from the alveolar sac into the capillaries in this region. And opposite, we want CO2 to come out of the blood. As your cells have undergone cellular respiration, CO2 is going to build up. We got to get rid of that. We want that to diffuse back into the alveolar sac and get rid of it when we exhale. So let's break this down and look a little bit more closely at the structures that make up the alveolar sacs. And you can see that in this diagram. So we've taken one alveoli and we've blown it up. And you can see we have a couple different structures here. First of all, you've got simple squamous cells. That's really important. We need something that's really thin that's going to allow diffusion to take place. And it almost looks like, if you really look closely at this diagram, especially on that interior section of the alveolus, it looks tiled. It looks like paving stones. And that's exactly what are called the type 1 pneumocytes. So most of the alveolus is made up of type 1. It's simply forming the wall of the alveolus. Now, we need to make sure that these alveoli can expand and contract, but when they contract, we don't want them to completely close up. We don't want this sac to completely collapse. And so you have cells that are going to produce surfactant. And if you remember from chemistry, surfactants lower surface tension. So we have to have some cells in there. That's their job. And those are the type 2 pneumocytes. So interspersed among the type 1, you have type 2 pneumocytes that are making a surfactant. It's going to coat the inside surface of the alveolus. That's to try to reduce the surface tension of the water. Remember, this is moist tissue here. And we know from chemistry that water has a high surface tension. And if those walls were to collapse and the sac was to collapse, the walls would cling to each other, and it would be hard to reopen that alveolus. And so that's why you need that surfactant to help make sure that takes place. Also, you see labeled here, you have some macrophages. And macrophages are part of your immune system, and part of their job is to pick up, again, even down in these really tiny structures, there's still going to be some dust particles. We don't have goblet cells anymore. There's no room for them, but we have macrophages that can perform some of that function. This membrane is really tiny. So the membrane is made up of the alveolus wall and the walls of the capillaries, which also have squamous cells. Very tiny. Here you can see half a micrometer. Very, very small, very thin. We need to make it efficient for the gases to diffuse. And of course, we're talking about CO2 and oxygen. So let's talk about and wrap this up and talk about the gas exchange in the alveoli. And in this diagram, you can see we're looking at two things happening here. And this is kind of showing a linkage between the lungs and the capillaries. And in the center there, you can see the heart. The heart, some of the blood vessels are going to pump. Some of the blood is going over to the lungs. It's going to get oxygenated. It's going to come back to the heart, and then the heart is going to pump it throughout your entire body. So let's look at that. So let's look at this region here, right there. And what you're seeing right there, it looks bluish, right? So that would mean that there is low oxygen. We're using that convention of blue meaning less oxygen. And what you have happening there is the pulmonary artery. So you have an artery that leaves the right ventricle of your heart, and it's going to pump blood to the lungs. You've got lots of CO2. You don't have as much oxygen. And since the CO2, things always diffuse from high to low concentration, we're going to get the CO2 to diffuse out of the blood and get into the alveolus. At the same time, simultaneously, over here, and this is all happening at the same time, we're having the opposite happen with oxygen. All right, you got high levels of oxygen in the air you just breathed into your alveolus. It's low in the blood, and again, diffusion from high to low concentration. Oxygen is going to enter the blood. We're going to reoxygenate the blood, and then we're going to send that oxygen-rich blood back to the heart, back to your left atrium. And that, down below, then at the very bottom in the little green circle, that highly oxygenated blood just got pumped by your left ventricle. That is the real workhorse of your heart, your left ventricle. And that's going to pump blood throughout your body. And when capillaries in your tissue, whether it's muscle tissue, anywhere throughout the brain tissue, there you have oxygen-rich blood. The cells in your body are working. They're consuming oxygen. So there's low level of oxygen in the tissue, high level of oxygen in your blood. It's going to diffuse out of your blood into the cell space and eventually into those cells so they can do their job. While they're doing their job, again, simultaneously in the same area, right here, you are going to start dumping, you're producing CO2, right? The cells are undergoing cellular respiration, so CO2 levels are going to start to build up. They'll exceed what is the CO2 level in the blood, and the CO2 will diffuse out of your tissue into the blood. So the blood is being depleted of oxygen, and it's being infused with CO2. And it will go back, and we'll repeat this cycle all over again. Real simple process, pretty straightforward if you remember the things you've already studied about diffusion. So let's kind of summarize this all for you. Let's start with oxygen transport. Oxygen doesn't diffuse very well in the liquid part of your blood, which is called the plasma. Very, very little is actually dissolving directly into the fluid. Most of it is going to be attached to that protein, that quaternary protein called hemoglobin. And once it's got oxygen attached, that's called oxyhemoglobin. As your oxygenated blood gets into tissue, the CO2 levels will help trigger the hemoglobin releasing that oxygen, because high levels of CO2 would indicate we got a lot of metabolism happening. So it will help make sure that the hemoglobin releases the oxygen. Also, pH dropping. Again, these are signposts of your body working, and muscle tissue produces lactic acid, which would drop the pH. So that means lots of activity. We need that oxygen. So that helps to trigger oxygen release from the hemoglobin also. And a third factor is temperature rising. Again, a lot of the energy your cells burn doesn't get used. It's lost as heat. So as the temperature rises, that is an indicator to your body, of course, that there's a lot of cellular activity taking place, and you want the oxygen to be released to help your tissues perform their jobs. Carbon dioxide transport, a little bit different. CO2, also not all that soluble in the liquid part of your blood, in the plasma. Much more, though, is carried by hemoglobin. So hemoglobin can carry both oxygen and CO2. We would refer to that as carbaminohemoglobin. But most of the CO2 is actually formed as it's going to attach as bicarbonate ion, form bicarbonate as CO2 combines with water. You get carbonic acid, and then you can see in my the little chemical equation, again from chemistry. That's a weak acid, carbonic acid, and it will partially dissociate and will release hydrogen ions. And of course, that's what would tend to make the blood a little more acidic too. It'll also contribute to it. So all three of those actions are reversed when you get to the alveoli. And eventually the CO2, again, moves out of the blood into the alveoli, and then you exhale it and get rid of it with each breath. So we did an overview of how your blood gets oxygenated as your body is performing all the functions that it has to. And that's why, again, I refer to the alveoli and the alveoli sacs. That's the business end of the respiratory system.